The grand hall of the alien court was filled with cold light, shining from crystal orbs floating above the ceiling. Nobles in long robes stood around with cruel eyes, their sharp faces glowing with pride and arrogance. At the center, on a throne carved from black stone, sat the alien baron, a figure both feared and hated. He had long silver horns curling from his head, and his voice echoed like iron scraping across stone. Every word he spoke was sharp, carrying the weight of power. The baron looked down at the gathering and smiled in mockery. Humans had been brought into his empire as workers, as slaves, as tools. To the baron's people, humans were weak creatures, soft and foolish. They believed humans had no courage, no honor, no strength to stand against alien rule. The baron enjoyed breaking their spirit, turning their pride into shame. But today, he had a new kind of cruelty in mind. He stood tall and raised his hand, calling for silence in the hall. The nobles bowed their heads, eager to hear his next command. The baron's eyes glowed with amusement, and his mouth twisted into a smile that was more dangerous than anger. "Today," the baron declared, "I will give my mute daughter to a human." A murmur of shock and laughter spread through the hall. The nobles leaned closer, whispering among themselves. Some laughed openly, others gasped in disbelief. The idea was strange, absurd, and yet perfectly cruel. The baron's daughter stood near him, hidden in the shadow of the throne. She was young, with pale skin and soft features, but her eyes carried deep sadness. Her lips never moved, her voice never came. She had been mute since birth, unable to speak a single word. Her silence was seen as weakness, a shame to her father's pride. The baron looked at her with no kindness, only as an object for his cruel game. "Let the humans see what happens when one of their kind is tied to silence," the baron said mockingly. He laughed, and the sound filled the hall like a storm. The nobles joined him, their laughter rising until it became a chorus of cruelty. The daughter lowered her head, ashamed, afraid, trapped. She did not choose this fate, but her father's command was absolute. At the far end of the hall, guards dragged in a human man. He was tall for his kind, his clothes worn from labor, his hands scarred from hard work, yet his eyes were steady, not broken, not afraid. He walked with quiet dignity, though chains bound his wrists. The nobles expected him to fall to his knees to beg for mercy, but the man stood straight, facing the baron without fear. The baron sneered, "Human, do you accept this gift, this daughter who cannot speak, who carries only shame?" He expected laughter. He expected the man to hesitate, to tremble, but the human's eyes did not move away. He looked once at the daughter, then back at the baron. His answer was calm, his voice firm. "I accept," he said. The hall erupted with laughter and mockery. The nobles shouted, "Fool! Slave! Curse!" They thought he was mad. They thought he had accepted humiliation worse than death. The baron's smile widened, pleased with the spectacle. To him, this was entertainment, proof of alien superiority. The mute daughter's eyes lifted slowly to the human. For the first time, she saw not mockery, not pity, but respect. It was only a glance, but it planted a seed deep inside her heart, a question she had never dared ask. Could someone truly see her as more than silence? The baron clapped his hands, sealing the cruel union. The guards released the man's chains, but not without shoving him to the ground first. Still, he rose again without complaint, his pride unbroken. The baron looked at the nobles and declared, "Let this be my gift to the humans. Let them choke on their weakness." The hall shook with cruel laughter once more. The mute daughter stood frozen, torn between fear and curiosity. The human stood beside her, steady and calm. He did not smile, he did not flinch. But his presence was a shield, a silent promise. In that moment, something invisible passed between them. The baron did not notice, nor did the nobles, but the daughter felt it. A spark of change, a whisper of destiny. The baron believed he had created the perfect joke. But deep inside the silence, the game had already begun. The human's quiet resolve and the daughter's hidden strength were about to rewrite the fate of the galaxy. And though the hall rang with laughter, the sound could not drown the quiet storm forming in two hearts. The human man was led away from the throne room, his new place in life sealed with the cruel laughter of the alien nobles. Chains no longer bound his hands, but their eyes still followed him like iron bars. To them, he was not a husband, not a warrior, not even a man. He was a joke, a piece in the baron's twisted game. Yet he walked forward without lowering his head, his steps steady and unbroken. His name was Kale, a name simple among humans, a name the nobles never cared to remember, but in Kale's chest burned a quiet strength that no alien whip could break. He had worked in the alien mines since boyhood, carrying stones heavier than his body. He had survived hunger, cold nights, and the cruelty of guards who laughed as they struck him. Through it all, Kale had learned silence, not of weakness, but of patience. He had learned that true strength is not in shouting, but in standing tall when the world tries to crush you. The Baron's mute daughter walked beside him, her steps soft, her head bowed low. She did not dare look at him for long, as if afraid her father's eyes still watched. Her world had always been made of silence, and silence had been her prison. But now a stranger stood beside he. A human mocked by all, and yet his silence felt different. It was not empty. It was steady, strong, alive. When they entered the small chambers given to them, Kale noticed the cruelty even in this gift. The room was bare, with stone walls cold as ice, a single bed, and no fire. It was meant to humiliate, to remind them both that this union was nothing but a punishment. Still, Kale did not complain. He did not curse. Instead, he helped the mute daughter sit, offering his hand with respect. For the first time in her life, she saw someone treat her as if she mattered. Kale spoke softly, though he knew she could not answer. "My name is Kale. I will not harm you. You are not my shame, whatever they say." His words carried no mockery, no pity, only truth. The mute daughter's heart trembled, her eyes filled with something she had not felt before. Hope. She wanted to answer, to thank him, to let her voice be heard, but as always, no sound came, only silence. Still, Kale's gaze told her he understood. Days passed, and the cruel laughter of the court faded into whispers. The nobles waited for the human to falter, for the girl to remain nothing more than mute. But in the quiet of their chambers, something began to grow. Kale would bring her food before eating himself. He would tell her stories of the mines, of the human songs sung in secret. Sometimes he laughed softly at his own memories, and though she could not laugh out loud, her eyes shone with silent joy. The daughter, whose name was Lyra, began to change. She still did not speak, but her silence no longer felt like a prison. Beside Kale, it felt like a bond, a language only they shared. She began to gesture with her hands, drawing shapes in the air. Kale would nod, patient, learning her silent world. Together, they built a bridge of trust, one gesture, one look, one unspoken promise at a time. But the alien Baron had not forgotten his cruel game. From afar, he watched with cold eyes, expecting the human to grow weary. He believed Kale would soon hate the silence, would see the girl as a curse. Yet each day that passed without failure made the Baron uneasy, for cruelty fed on weakness, and in Kale, no weakness could be found. One evening, as the pale moons rose over the alien citadel, Kale sat near the small window of their chamber. He looked out at the stars, his voice low but filled with fire. "Someday, Lyra, humans will not bow. Someday we will stand as equals, maybe even as more." She watched him, her heart beating faster at his words. He spoke not as a slave, not as a victim, but as a man who believed in tomorrow. And though she could not speak, she felt his dream stir something deep within her, something that whispered, perhaps one day, she would not be silent. The court mocked, the Baron laughed, but behind the stone walls, a bond was forming. Kale's quiet resolve was becoming a shield around Lyra's fragile heart, and in that shield, her silence began to tremble, not with fear, but with the promise of a voice yet to be born. The Baron thought he had given his daughter away as a joke, but fate was weaving a story far greater than his cruelty. The human and the mute daughter were no longer pawns in his game. They were becoming something he could not control, something dangerous, something powerful. And though the night was still filled with silence, a storm was already growing within it. Lyra had always lived in silence. From the day she was born, no sound had ever escaped her lips. The doctors of the alien court had examined her, tested her, and finally declared her hopeless. A broken child, they whispered, a shame to the Baron's proud line. And so her life had been spent in shadows, ignored by her father, mocked by her people, unseen except we. And used as an example of weakness, her chamber in the Baron's palace had once been like a prison, the walls high, the doors heavy, the silence endless. She would watch from her window as other children laughed, trained, and shouted in the courtyards. Their voices were like knives cutting her heart, reminding her of what she could never have. Every day she asked the same question in her mind. Why was I born without a voice? Her father had no patience for weakness. When he looked at her, it was with disappointment and disgust. She remembered clearly the day he first called her mute, not as a word, but as a curse. From that day, the court never called her by name, only the mute daughter. And so Lyra buried her feelings deep, hiding her pain in silence. If she could not speak, then she would not cry where they could see her tears. But now, for the first time in her life, someone stood beside her without cruelty. Kale, the human, did not see her as broken. When he looked at her, his eyes did not carry pity. They carried respect. When he spoke, his words were gentle, as if he believed she could hear every meaning in his heart. And when she gestured with her hands, awkward and slow, he watched patiently, trying to understand. No one had ever done that for her before. Her silent world began to change. The silence no longer pressed down on her chest like a weight. It became something softer, something shared. Kyle's voice filled the empty spaces, steady and calm, like a fire warming her cold nights. And even though she could not answer, she felt her silence was not shame anymore, but part of their bond. At night, when Kyle slept near the window, Lyra would stay awake, staring at the stars. She would mouth words in secret, words she had never spoken. Father, voice, freedom, Kyle. Her lips formed the shapes, but no sound came. Still, she did not stop. For the first time, same time she had the courage to try, because in her heart, she wanted to answer Kale's kindness. She wanted to stand beside him, not as a burden, but as something more. The court, however, never let her forget their cruelty. When she walked through the halls with Kyle, nobles whispered and laughed. They said the human would soon regret his choice. They said the Baron's daughter was nothing but a dead weight. Lyra heard every word, every cruel laugh, and though she could not reply, she held her head higher than before. Kale's quiet presence gave her strength to endure their poison. One afternoon, Lyra wandered into the old garden behind their chamber. The air was heavy with the scent of alien flowers, glowing softly under twin suns. Kale followed her, watching as she touched the petals gently. He smiled and said, "You like them, don't you?" She nodded quickly, her eyes shining. Then she raised her hands, trying to form a shape in the air. Kale tilted his head, trying to understand. "Flower," he guessed, and she smiled. Her silent laughter lit her face, and Kale felt something stir inside him, a quiet promise to protect her. Still, inside her heart, Lyra carried fear. Her father's shadow followed her even in dreams. She remembered the way he looked at her, as if she were less than dust. She remembered his cruel laugh when he gave her away to Kale. Sometimes she wondered, was she only a tool in someone's game? Would Kale one day grow tired of her silence, the way her father had? The fear gnawed at her, though she never showed it. But Kale's actions kept breaking the chains of that fear. He would share food with her even when he was hungry. He would sit with her in silence, making the silence feel safe. And each night, before sleep, he would whisper softly, "You are not a curse, Lyra. You are not weak." She could not speak, but her heart shouted in silence, wanting to believe, needing to believe. The more time passed, the more Lyra began to see herself differently. She was no longer only the mute daughter. In Kyle's eyes, she was the Ira, a person, a soul, a light, and for the first time she began to dream not of what she had lost, but of what she might one day find. Her lips formed words in the darkness, and though no sound came, she swore she could almost hear her own voice whispering back. The Baron had thrown her into this union to mock both human and daughter, but in the silence he mocked, something dangerous was growing. Not weakness, not shame, but strength. Lyra's silent world was no longer empty, it was waking. And deep inside her, where her voice had slept for so long, a storm was waiting to be born. The alien Baron believed his joke was complete. He had given his mute daughter to a human, and he expected their union to be nothing but misery. But outside the cold stone walls of his palace, the Empire was restless. Whispers spread in the markets, in the mines, in the camps where humans worked under alien whips. The people spoke in hushed voices of the human who had accepted the Baron's cruel gift without fear. Kale's name began to drift from mouth to mouth, carried like a secret fire. He was not noble, not a warrior, not a leader, yet the story of his quiet courage gave strength to the hopeless. Humans whispered that if one man could face the Baron without bowing, perhaps they too could stand tall. Even some of the Baron's subjects, broken under his iron rule, felt a strange spark in their hearts. The spark of rebellion, the spark of change. Lyra sensed it too, though she did not fully understand. Whenever Kyle walked through the courtyards, she noticed the way slaves and workers looked at him. Their eyes carried questions, their voices lowered when he passed, and though Kyle never sought their attention, his very presence became a symbol. Lyra began to realize that silence was not the only prison. Fear was the greater one, and Kale was quietly breaking it piece by piece. But in the shadows of the Empire, spies carried every whisper back to the Baron. One evening, as Kale and Lyra shared a quiet meal, a guard entered their chamber, bowing low. "Lord Baron requests the presence of his daughter," the guard said, his voice sharp. Lyra froze, fear flooding her eyes. She had not been summoned in many days. Kale stood quickly, stepping between her and the guard. But the guard smirked. "Do not forget your place, human. The master calls. The slave obeys." Lyra's hands trembled as she followed the guard into the great hall. The Baron sat on his throne, his expression dark with suspicion. His voice boomed. "My daughter, I hear whispers that you and this human have become more than a joke." Lyra lowered her head, her lips pressed tightly together. The Baron's eyes narrowed, his horns gleaming in the firelight. "You bring shame by standing beside him with pride. You were meant to humiliate him, not to inspire him." He leaned forward, his voice cold as ice. "You are my daughter, mute and useless. Do not forget it. You are nothing without my name." The words struck her like blows, tearing through the fragile hope she had built. But deep inside, she remembered Cale's voice, his steady words. "You are not weak." Her father's cruelty could no longer erase them. When Lyra returned to their chamber, Cale read the fear in her eyes. She told him the story through gestures, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with silent sorrow. Cale listened carefully, then clenched his fists. "They fear change," he whispered. "They fear that even a voice trapped in silence can still spark hope." Lyra stared at him, her heart racing. Could it be true? Could her silence still carry power? The days that followed grew darker. The Baron increased his watch on the humans. Guards patrolled the streets with sharper eyes. Anyone caught whispering Cale's name was beaten, sometimes dragged away and never seen again. But the more the Baron tried to crush the whispers, the louder they grew in secret. It was like trying to hold smoke in a cloe. Said fist, the harder he squeezed, the faster it escaped. Kyle, though cautious, did not back down. When he walked among the workers, he offered small kindnesses, a shared piece of bread, a word of courage, a steady glance. Lyra followed, silent but radiant, and her presence spoke louder than any words. The people saw how she walked beside him, how she was no longer bowed in shame. They saw strength in her silence, dignity in her eyes, and they began to believe that change was possible. But the Baron was not blind. He summoned his council, furious that his mockery was turning against him. "This human has become a symbol," he snarled, "and symbols are more dangerous than swords." The nobles nodded, their laughter replaced with unease. Some urged the Baron to crush Cale at once, to kill him before rebellion could spread, but the Baron's pride was too great. "No," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "I will not give him the honor of a martyr's death. I will make him break. I will make the girl watch as he falls." That night, Lyra could not sleep. She sat by the window, watching the stars, her hands pressed against her lips. She wanted to speak, to warn Cale, to cry out against her father's cruelty. But silence chained her throat. No sound would come. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but Kyle wiped them gently, his voice steady. "Do not fear, Lyra. No matter what test they put before me, I will not break." Her heart ached with both fear and hope. She had lived her whole life in silence, believing it was her curse. But now she began to wonder if silence was only the beginning. Perhaps hidden in her quiet world was a secret yet to awaken. Perhaps her father's cruelty had only planted the seed of something greater. The Baron thought he controlled the game, but rebellion was moving like shadows through the empire, and in those shadows, Kyle and Lyra stood as a light, small, fragile, but unshaken, and in the silence of Lyra's heart, the storm grew stronger, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The Baron's pride was wounded. What was meant as a joke had turned into whispers of hope, and whispers were more dangerous than blades. His daughter, the mute girl he had called useless, now walked beside a human with dignity. And the human himself, instead of breaking under mockery, stood stronger with each passing day. The Baron could not allow it, not when his rule was built on fear and control. One evening, he gathered his nobles in the great hall. The torches burned blue, the air thick with the scent of iron and smoke. The Baron's voice thundered, "If the people will not learn through silence, then they shall learn through spectacle." His eyes glowed with cruel light, and his smile twisted like a blade. "I will test this human, and before all, he will fail, and when he falls, his shame will be remembered forever." The next day, the guards came for Kyle. They dragged him from his chamber while Lyra watched in terror. She ran after them, her hands reaching out, but the guards shoved her back. Her silent cry filled the corridors, her eyes wide with fear. Cale turned his head once as they pulled him away, his gaze calm, his lips forming silent words she could read. "Do not be afraid." The court gathered in the arena, a vast circle of stone surrounded by towering walls. It was where the Baron displayed punishments, where rebels were broken, where fear was fed to the crowd. Now Cale stood at the center, his hands unchained, his eyes steady. The Baron raised his hand for silence, his voice booming across the arena. "Here is the human who thought himself strong. Today, he will prove his worth, or die." The gates at the far end of the arena opened with a groan. From the shadows emerged a beast, massive and furious. Its skin was armored. Its eyes burned with hunger. Its roar shook the ground. The crowd gasped, then cheered, their voices echoing through the stone walls. It was a creature bred for war, and no human had ever survived its claws. Lyra stood among the nobles, her body trembling, her heart pounded so hard she thought it might shatter her chest. She wanted to scream, to call out, to stop this madness, but no sound came. Her throat locked in chains of silence. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched Kale face the beast alone. Kale did not run. He did not kneel. He stood tall, his hands ready, his eyes fixed on the creature. The beast charged, the ground shaking under its weight. Kale rolled aside, the claws missing him by a breath. The crowd roared, half in excitement, half in mockery. The Baron leaned back, expecting the fight to end quickly. But Kale rose again, steady and calm. He grabbed a broken spear left from past battles, holding it firm. Every strike of the beast pushed him back. Every roar thundered in his ears, but he did not falter. He did not bow. With each move he made, the crowd's laughter dimmed, replaced by uneasy silence. Lyra's nails dug into her palms, her lips moving desperately. She mouthed his name again and again, as if sheer will could carry her voice. Kyle, 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 her heart screamed. And for the first time, something inside her broke. Her silence cracked under the weight of fear and love. Her body shook as she tried once more to speak. The beast cornered Kyle, slamming its massive claws against the ground. The stone split, dust filled the air. Kale stumbled back. The crowd shouted, the Baron smiled. The end was near. Lyra's chest burned, her throat strained. She felt as if the universe itself demanded sound. And then it happened. A voice tore from her lips, broken but real. It was not loud at first, not clear, but it was hers. "Stop!" she cried. The single word echoed through the arena like thunder. The crowd fell silent, eyes wide, the nobles frozen. The Baron rose from his throne in shock, his face twisting in disbelief. The beast hesitated, its head turning toward the sound. Kale's eyes widened, not at the danger, but at the miracle. Lyra stood trembling, her hands pressed against her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. She had spoken, after a lifetime of silence. She had spoken. And her voice carried not only sound, but power. The air itself seemed to vibrate with her words. The beast growled, uncertain, as if bound by something greater than chains. Kale seized the moment, driving his spear forward, forcing the monster back. The crowd gasped, not cheering now but afraid. They had seen the impossible. The mute daughter had found her voice. The Baron's mockery had turned into his greatest humiliation. Lyra collapsed to her knees, shaking her breath ragged, but Kale rushed to her, lifting her with steady arms. "You spoke," he whispered, awe in his voice. She nodded weakly, tears falling, her lips trembling as if she could not believe it herself. The arena remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down like a storm. The Baron's eyes burned with fury. This was not the spectacle he had planned. This was not his victory. Instead of breaking the human, he had awakened something far more dangerous, a voice that should never have existed, a voice that might shatter his rule, and as he clenched his fists, he knew the game had changed forever. The arena was silent. The crowd that once laughed at the human and mocked the mute daughter now stood frozen. Every eye was on Lyra, the girl who was never meant to speak, the girl who had just shattered her silence. The Baron's cruel smile had vanished, replaced with shock and fury. His throne seemed smaller now, his pride shaken. Kale held Lyra in his arms, his heart pounding with both fear and awe. He whispered, "You spoke, Lyra, you spoke." His voice trembled, not from weakness but from wonder. For he knew this was not just a sound, not just a word. It was a miracle, and miracles carried power. The beast, towering and furious, had paused. Its claws dug into the stone, its body tense, its growl rumbling low, but it did not strike. It did not charge. It stared at Lyra as if chained by her voice. The crowd began to murmur, fear mixing with confusion. What kind of power could stop a creature bred only for blood? Lyra, still trembling, tried again. Her lips parted, her voice rough but real. "Stay back," she cried, and the impossible happened. The beast roared in pain, as if her words struck deeper than any blade. It stumbled, its massive body shuddering, its eyes burning with fear. The nobles gasped, some stepping away, their arrogance cracking into terror. Kale's grip tightened around her hand. He whispered urgently, "Lyra, it listens to you. Your voice is more than sound." Lyra's chest heaved, her mind racing. She had spent her whole life in silence, believing she was broken. Now her voice was not just sound, it was command, a force that bent even monsters to her will. The Baron rose from his throne, his cloak swirling like storm clouds. "Enough," he roared. "This is trickery, this is madness." But his words could not erase what they had seen. His daughter, the girl he mocked, the girl he despised, had spoken, and her voice carried more strength than his armies. Lyra looked at Kale, fear and wonder in her eyes. She whispered, "I spoke." The words shaking but real. Kale nodded, his own voice steady. "Yes, and the galaxy will never forget it." He turned back to the beast, ready to strike if needed, but the tall creature lowered its head, trembling before Lyra's presence. It obeyed her without chains, without whips, without fear. The crowd no longer laughed. Whispers spread like fire. The mute daughter has spoken. Her voice has power. The Baron's bloodline is not weak but strong. Some whispered with awe, some with fear, but all understood one truth. The Baron's mockery had become his downfall. Lyra stood, her legs weak but her spirit rising. She looked at the creature once more, her voice firmer now. "Go," she commanded. The beast let out one final roar, then turned and retreated into the shadows of the arena. The gates closed behind it with a heavy thud. Silence followed, but this silence was different. It was not the silence of mockery, but the silence of awe. The Baron's fists clenched, his horns glinting under the pale firelight. He shouted, "Do not be fooled. She is still weak. This changes nothing." But even his voice, powerful and feared for so long, sounded hollow. The people no longer looked only at him. They looked at Lyra, the daughter who had found her voice, the human who stood beside her. Together, they were something the Baron could not control. Kale stepped forward, his eyes locked on the nobles. "You mock humans as weak, but today you saw strength, not mine, but hers." His words rang clear, carried by the silence of the crowd. She was called useless, broken, mute, but she was never weak, and neither are we. The crowd shifted, their whispers louder now. Hope stirred in hearts that had long been drowned in fear. Lyra's hands shook, but she lifted her chin, her voice still raw but steady. "I am not my father's shame." The nobles gasped, some covering their mouths. The Baron's eyes burned with rage. He stepped down from his throne, his voice thunderous. "You dare defy me!" But Lyra did not flinch. For the first time in her life, she faced her father not with silence but with strength. Kale stood at her side, his presence unshaken. Together, they faced the storm of the Solus. The Baron's fury, the arena trembled with tension, the crowd torn between fear of their ruler and awe of the miracle they had witnessed. The whispers grew into a quiet chant, hesitant at first, then stronger. "Lyra, Lyra, Lyra." The Baron raised his hand to silence them, but the sound did not stop. It grew louder, bolder, filling the arena like thunder. For the first time, his voice was not the loudest. For the first time, the people looked at someone else with hope. And in that moment, the Baron realized that his power was slipping. Lyra, the daughter he mocked, had become a force he could not crush. Her impossible voice was no longer just hers, it belonged to the people. A voice that could awaken courage, a voice that could break chains. And though her body trembled, though fear still lived in her heart, she knew one truth. Her silence was gone forever. Her voice was the beginning of change. The arena still echoed with the chant of Lyra's name. What began as a whisper had grown into thunder, rolling through the hearts of humans and aliens alike. The Baron stood frozen, his fists clenched, his pride bleeding. For the first time in his reign, he felt the weight of fear pressing on him, not from enemies outside, but from his own people within. Lyra swayed, her body weak from the strain of speaking. Kael held her steady, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. She leaned on him, trembling, but her eyes were filled with fire. Her lips still shook with the memory of sound, with the miracle that had broken her silence. She had spoken not once but many times, and each word had carried power. The nobles glanced at one another, uncertainty spreading across their proud faces. Some bowed their heads, too afraid to meet the Baron's gaze. Others stared at Lyra with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not mockery, but respect. The people in the lower tiers, the workers and slaves, were not silent anymore. They shouted her name, Kael's name, their voices rising like a storm against the stone walls. The Baron roared, his voice shaking the air. "Silence, all of you, silence." But his order was drowned out, his power slipping with every cry of the crowd. For years, fear had ruled them. Now hope had broken through, and hope was far louder than fear. Kael raised his hand and slowly the crowd quieted. His voice rang steady. "This is not about me. It is about her, Lyra, the daughter you mocked, the voice you tried to bury. She has risen." He looked directly at the nobles, his eyes unflinching. "And if she can rise, so can we all." Lyra took a trembling step forward, her hands still clutching Kael's. She faced the crowd, her chest tight, her throat aching, but she would not stay silent now. Not anymore. Her voice, raw but strong, carried across the arena. "We are not weak," she said, each word like fire. "We are not broken." The crowd erupted once more, the sound shaking the very stones. Humans shouted with pride, aliens whispered with awe, and in that noise the chains of fear began to crack. The Baron's face twisted, his horns glinting, his pride screaming at the sight of his own daughter defying him. He raised his hand to strike, but something stopped him. The sight of the people no longer bowing, no longer trembling, staring at him with eyes filled not with fear, but with anger. He lowered his hand slowly, his rage boiling. "This is not the end," he growled, his voice venomous. "This is only the beginning of their suffering." But even as he spoke, he knew his words no longer held the same power. The seed of rebellion had been planted, and nothing could erase it. That night, Kale and Lyra returned to their chamber under heavy guard. The nobles feared what the crowd had seen, feared what the girl's voice meant. But behind the locked doors, Kale looked at Lyra with pride. "You changed everything," he said softly. "Your voice is the beginning of freedom." Lyra shook, her head, tears in her eyes. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Our voices, yours and mine together, they will change the galaxy." In the days that followed, the empire shifted. Whispers spread faster than soldiers could silence them. Songs were sung in secret, songs about the human who stood tall, and the girl who found her voice. The workers in the mines hummed them, the slaves in the fields whispered them. Even the nobles in their halls could not stop hearing them. Hope had become a river, unstoppable, flowing through every corner of the Baron's land. Lyra trained her voice in secret, each day stronger than the last. Kale stood beside her, guiding her, protecting her, believing in her. Her words grew clearer, her strength grew deeper, and with every sound she felt her chains fall away. She was no longer mute, no longer broken, no longer the Baron's shame. She was Lyra, a daughter, a wife, a leader, a symbol. The Baron watched with burning hatred. His plans to humiliate had turned into his greatest defeat, but he was not finished. His pride would not allow it. He began to plot in the shadows, swearing that if his daughter stood against him, he would crush her with his own hands. Yet deep inside, even he felt the chill of doubt. For how do you crush a voice that has awakened a people? One evening, as Kyle and Lyra looked at the stars through their small window, Lyra spoke softly. "Do you think the galaxy will listen?" Kale smiled faintly, his scars glowing in the moonlight. "They already are," he answered, "and they will never stop." Lyra leaned against him, her heart finally free. For the first time, she believed her voice was not only hers but belonged to all who had suffered in silence. The Baron had mocked her, the court had laughed at her, the world had ignored her. But now her voice was rising and nothing could stop it. It was the voice of hope, the voice of rebellion, the voice of tomorrow. And though the battles ahead would be fierce, though darkness would still come, Lyra knew one truth. She was no longer silent, and the galaxy would never be silent again.